Yeah, that makes sense.
Joe, if you want to get started, I don't see them on, but I'm.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to call to order the December 8th, 2020 ONCC Flight Quiet meeting.
Morning.
Jeanette, can we have a roll call?
Yes, Bensonville.
Here.
City of Chicago 39th Ward.
Here.
Des Plaines. Elmhurst.
Here.
Harwood Heights.
Here.
Niles.
Here.
Park Ridge.
Here.
River Grove.
Here.
Schaumburg.
Here.
Schiller Park.
Here.
And Wooddale.
Here.
Have a quorum.
Okay, thank you. Can I get a motion to approve the minutes of the October 27th, 2020 Flight Quiet Committee meeting?
I'll move, so.
Second. Park Ridge.
Jeanette?
Bensonville.
Yes.
City of Chicago 39th Ward.
Yes.
Des Plaines. Elmhurst.
Yes.
Harwood Heights. Niles.
Yes.
Park Ridge.
Yes.
River Grove.
Yes.
Schaumburg.
Yes.
Schiller Park.
Yes.
And Wooddale.
Yes.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Jeanette. At this point, I'm going to give an opportunity for ONCC members to make any comments that they would like to make to the group. Well, if there are none, I'll continue. We're at number 4 now. Ryan, can you give us an update on IFQ?
Sure. Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
At our last meeting, we updated you through week 33 of the interim flight quiet runway rotation program. As a reminder, we restarted the program in September, and it will run through the roughly the end of January of next year, when we close down runway 9 right 27 left for construction of the extension that will take place next year. So with week 34, I'll start. We have reports week 34 through 39 to show you today. Week 34 was a crosswind runway week. We had 23% utilization of the designated runways. The primaries were 22 right arrivals and 22 left departures. We did have some inclement weather on several nights during the week that resulted in restrictions in our ability to stick to the rotation schedule. So we only saw the 23% utilization. It was roughly split pretty evenly as far as wind conditions with west flow and east flow. So we were utilizing both primary and secondary configurations for the week. Week 35, we're back to east-west runways with 28 center arrivals and 28 right departures as our primary configuration. We saw 89% utilization of the designated runways with an average time of 8 hours and 25 minutes in flight quiet. That resulted in a start time of 10:23 p.m. average and an average stop time of 6:48 a.m. And as you can see, we're primarily in west flow for the week 79% of the time. So primarily in our primary configuration. Week 36, back to crosswind runways, primary arrivals 22 right and departures on 22 left. This week we only saw 16% utilization. As you recall, the week of November 1st, we opened up new runway 9 center, 27 center on Thursday, November 5th. And there was a considerable amount of activity going on in the North Airfield in conjunction with that opening, including several flight checks that were needed during the week for that runway. So unfortunately, we only saw 16% utilization. We were primarily west flow for the week at 95% of the time. So we were in our primary configuration for the majority of the week. Week 37, back to east-west runways, primary configuration, 9 right departures and 10 left arrivals. Again, several nights of construction and FAA flight checks, along with some inclement weather, caused the utilization to be much lower at 29%. Average time in flight quiet was 7 hours and 59 minutes. And again, west flow for the majority of the week, 97%, which is typical for this time of year. And you can see those nights where we had significant impacts of FAA flight checks, again, in relation to runway 9 center, 27 center opening. Week 38, back to crosswind runways, primary 4 left departures and 4 right arrivals. Again, we had some inclement weather on the nights of November 15th and 16th, which restricted the program. 27% average utilization for the week. Average start time 10:22 p.m. Average stop time 6:33 a.m. With an average time in flight quiet of 8 hours and 11 minutes. And again, west flow 75% for the week, typical for this time of year. Week 39, back to east-west runways, primary configuration, 10 center arrivals, 10 left departures, 89% utilization of designated runways for the week. We saw an average of 84 operations during flight quiet mode, with an average of 8 hours and 38 minutes per night in flight quiet. Again, west flow being the primary airport configuration for the week. And that brings us up through week 39, the week of November 22nd. Now, Chairman, that'll conclude item number 4.
Anybody have any questions? Okay, thank you, Ryan. All right, we're going to 5 now, fly quiet. Going to be looking at the fly quiet process again. We're bringing this up again because we are getting to the point where we're going to have to start making some real decisions after the first of the year. We will be getting together, hopefully, to start making some real decisions. With that, Ryan?
Yeah, so back to this slide. I know many of you are kind of tired of seeing this slide, and you might get a little more irritated because I want to spend some time on this slide today, actually. So as a reminder of the process of what we're trying to do and the steps that we're looking at to meet our goal of developing a new flight quiet program for O'Hare. We are still here in the developing and approving alternatives position. At the last meeting, we presented 7 alternatives that were developed partly through committee discussions, as well as alternatives that were submitted by committee members. The idea was to get all the alternatives on the table for you to consider, and then from there, narrow it down to a handful that we can continue to review and revise in this next step, to a point where the committee is comfortable with 1 or 2 that they feel is worthy of recommendation for full commission consideration. Now, we had those 7 alternatives, and initially the thought was to maybe filter those down to a handful, but that's entirely up to this committee. We can spend time on all 7 alternatives and continue to look at all 7 of them, review, revise, look at various impacts. However, that's going to, the downside of that, of course, is that's going to mean that we're going to spend more time in this next box. We've already spent a lot of time in the develop and approve alternatives box. The more alternatives that we move forward with, the more time we're going to spend reviewing and analyzing them. But that's entirely up to this committee. And we're fine analyzing as many alternatives as you think is, that have merits. And so at the last meeting, there was a vote to remove a handful from consideration. And then the thought was to move forward with the ones that were left to review and revise further until the committee has a good understanding of what the program is, and we have consensus for a recommendation. And so I believe today, though, that we are going to look at reconsidering some of the alternatives that were removed from consideration at the last meeting. And so with that, I just wanted to make sure that everyone understood where we're at with the process. We're still, because we have not started revising alternatives, we're still at this developing and approving the alternatives that consist of the major concepts that we've been talking to date. So are there any questions about the process or concerns?
No questions?
Can I jump in here?
Yes.
Thank you, Chairman. So obviously there have been some anxieties raised about the motion I made at the last Fly Quiet committee meeting to eliminate 4 of the alternatives presented at that time. In an effort to move the process along, I made a motion to eliminate alternatives D, E, F, and G that were before the committee for consideration. That motion prevailed. I had and continue to maintain concerns that this committee is getting stuck in analysis paralysis. I had simply wished to narrow down our options so we could focus on a few key viable options that we could refine for final approval. I believe that some of these alternatives did not have the support of the committee. That was evident. I now understand some feel the decision was made too hastily and those options were not allowed sufficient consideration and analysis. In the spirit of cooperation and my intent to build bridges where possible, I propose that we vote on the reconsideration of each option separately to allow for the committee to choose whether or not they want to have further discussion on each of these proposals. Chairman Annunzio, I would like you to ask for a motion and a second to reconsider options D, E, F, and G individually. Thank you.
All right. Any other comment anybody want to make to that? If not, would somebody like to make the motion to reconsider D, E, F, and G?
So moved, Malcolm Chester Displains.
Second Schuler.
All right. We have a voice vote. Jeanette?
Sorry.
Oh.
This is for consideration to add
for
back
it.
on.
After that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask a subsidiary motion to divide the question so that we can go at each one individually.
Bensonville,
Yes.
City of Chicago, 39th Ward,
Yes.
Des Plaines,
Yes.
Elmhurst,
Yes.
Harwood Heights,
Yes.
Niles,
Yes.
Park Ridge,
Yes.
River Grove,
Yes.
Schaumburg.
Yes.
Schiller Park,
Yes.
and Wooddale.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, it looks like it passed. Now to make sure that we do this procedurally right, I'm going to ask to divide this question into its individual constituents. So somebody like a motion to make a motion to divide the question?
I'll make a motion to divide the question into the 4 options.
Second,
Second, Schaumburg.
want to make a vote there? Jeanette?
Chairman, before you take a vote, the City of Chicago has a question for the group.
Okay.
Chairman, I understand the motion on the floor is currently to divide the question. What is the question that is being divided?
Well, the alternatives. See, so right now what we have, we made a motion to bring all 4 back. All right. And just to make sure that everybody understands, we're going to be looking at these individually. I want to make sure that the group understands it by dividing the question so that we can look at each alternative. So we'll have a discussion for each alternative as at the appropriate time.
Understood, Chairman. That's good. Can we spend a minute or two fleshing out the exact verbiage on the motion on which you are voting? It's important for the administrative record.
Okay. All right. So the question is.
So all I'm asking is, you have a motion on the floor with a second. Can we just review the language of the exact motion so that everybody knows what they're voting on?
So if I can, since I made the motion, I believe the motion is to reinstate the alternatives individually.
Well, Chairman, you've already taken a motion on the first action today. You've already approved that. So all 7 alternatives are now back in play. The city of Chicago is just asking for clarification as to going forward on the new
All right,
motion.
okay, let's back up those. So if the understanding is right now is that all of them are back in the play right now, individually.
That's my understanding, correct, Chairman? Because Jeanette, the motion just passed.
Yes.
So alternatives A through H are back on the table. So Chicago's just asking for clarification as to how do you want to handle going forward.
Okay, so what I'm going to ask is somebody withdraw my motion for the division.
I'll withdraw the motion.
Second. Do you need a
All
second for that?
You don't need a
Well, it's
second.
been withdrawn, okay? Is that
So just to be clear where we're at?
That's fine, Chairman. We don't object to the concept of the motion. I just want to make sure that the verbiage of the motion is very clear. My goal is never to have the committee members or even myself just uncertain.
But
So I guess,
frankly, the way it should have been done was that it should have been divided first, and then we could have looked at each one of them individually. I'm sorry, Evan, go on.
I just want to get back to our starting point at the last Fly Quiet meeting. So that's all. Basically, that's what I want to get to. Is that where we're at?
I think we're there.
Yes, and Chairman, I would say, I don't believe it's necessary for the committee to vote on alternative A. Alternative A is the status quo, which is existing Fly Quiet. And for environmental purposes, that's an absolute essential. So you are welcome to vote on alternative A, but at the end of the day, the city is going to turn that in. So I'm not sure that's the best use of your time. I would encourage the committee to focus on alternatives B through H, which are something of a change.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, so I appreciate everyone reconsidering that and bringing everything back so we're all back on square one again. Can we plot a path forward and maybe figure out what we do at the next 3 or 4 meetings so we don't continue to come back to this point, which is what I'm concerned is going to happen. I'd like to see at our next Fly Quiet meeting, what are we going to do? And the following meeting, what is the plan for that?
It seems to me what we got to do at the next meeting is begin to pare down our alternatives. We're going to have to make a serious discussion as to which ones really don't meet our needs to the point where we shouldn't spend any more time on them at the moment.
So to that end, can we agree that we will analyze all of the different alternatives, and then the following meeting, we all agree that we will vote to eliminate? And I guess some of these meetings may not fit in our perfect hour window anymore. These may have to be extended 2-hour meetings, and I'm okay with that. I don't know where everyone else stands. I'd like to hear their opinions.
Chairman, I'd also echo that from Evan in that to go through alternatives B through H substantively could require additional time. And so one way is to extend the length of the 1-hour meeting to something longer. Another alternative is to meet more frequently.
Can I ask the point of clarification? So to Evan's point, like if we're going to start this discussion today and start going through the alternatives, if we're discussing an alternative today that as a committee we have concerns with, is there anything today to preclude us from bringing that to a vote today to eliminate an alternative if our discussion is leading us in that direction, and deferring it to the next meeting potentially sets us back and having to sort of revisit that discussion?
there's nothing stopping you from making a motion.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, Karen, this is Aaron. I would recommend make a motion, but don't take a vote today because the agenda is very clear about a motion to reconsider and a discussion of edits to alternatives B, C, and H. So we don't want to repeat, what happened in a prior meeting. So I think it's okay to have active discussion and draw a conclusion and make a motion, take a second, and potentially table that motion so that we don't get into a trick bag of making motions and making votes hastily.
Okay.
Particularly since the voting of yay or nay is not explicitly on the agenda.
I think also what we can do maybe for the next meeting is begin to and you got to help me out with this, you guys. We got to start prioritizing these to begin with, because there are a couple here that probably don't require much discussion and could be eliminated rather quickly as opposed to others. So, I mean, is it a good idea to treat each one of these equally when we know right now that some of them are less likely than others?
Chairman, from our perspective right now, they are all equal. So now they're all kind of on the table, if it were. And so we have 7 alternatives to refine. So our next meeting, as of right now at this moment, our next meeting would be looking at the refinement of all 7 of those alternatives. And as we keep moving forward with reviewing and revising those alternatives at any step of the way, committee members can make a motion to eliminate one of the alternatives. You can do that today, or we can do that at the next meeting as you see, as these alternatives get further refined. But from our perspective right now, we have 7 that we're going to move forward with. And we're not going to, I guess, treat one alternative with a higher priority than another at this point.
Okay. All right, I want to be clear with that because there was a sense last meeting that some were more important.
Yeah, the discussion last meeting that some, at least from my perspective, the committee, discussed the merits of some of the alternatives, and it seemed that the characteristics of some alternatives were more favorable than others. But that's for this committee to discuss and decide.
Okay.
So
right now, I noticed that Dan has a comment. Do you want to make a comment, Dan?
Yes, one of the things we think the committee could move forward with is departure headings, because we think that ties in to the full airfield versus north-south airfield debate as to not only altitude, but actual flight tracks when we consider full-length departures. So I think that's one tool you can use to narrow the field. The other thing, as far as what's holding up the committee, we're still waiting for answers from the FAA and airlines on being able to close runways. And that's another consideration for which alternatives move forward that should be resolved in the very near future. And I guess the question is there any update on that for this meeting?
Well, the CDA has discussed and continues to discuss that topic with both the FAA and the air carriers, and there have been no objections to date. So, I guess to answer your question is no one has said no.
But
and everyone indicates that it's entirely feasible. So we have not heard any serious objections to date that would stop that issue from being considered.
But is that a commitment for the next 30 to 40 years? We would need that assurance in perpetuity for some of the expectations of these configurations to be met. So is this something that will somehow be translated into an assurance that this would be the case?
And I've been involved in this in a long time, and if there's one thing I learned, there's no such thing as a decision made in perpetuity.
And that's what we were assuming in some of these alternatives, is that the committee needs to assume that it
No, I
may
think
be feasible,
yeah.
but it may not happen.
No, I mean, what might be decided today could change in 10 years. That's what I'm looking at. And if a decision has changed in 10 years, then we got to modify whatever we have.
Dan, I can't tell you that for the next 40 years, that's going to be the case at this airport. I mean, some may
Well-
think the change over the last 20 years, you know, and this committee has been around for over 20 years and participating in, you know, how the airport operates during the overnight hours, and will continue to participate. And so if there are things that change, technology or other conditions that warrant relooking at the program, that's always up for consideration.
And I will add, the CDA is willing to continue conversations with the airlines. Certainly, as this committee narrows down alternatives and gets closer to a vote, I'm happy to have additional conversations with the airlines so that they know the committee's preferences, right? Because this committee is going to vote, and before we turn it in, the blue box on the right, CDA request, you know, I'm going to brief the airlines so that they know what it is that I'm submitting. I'm not going to surprise them on the day that we turn it in. But so yes, I'm happy to continue those conversations, keep them briefed, and give you any feedback as we receive it.
Hey, Joe, can I say something?
Yes, Karen.
So I think all of this is really good discussion, but I think to Evan's earlier point, like, we are clearly bogged down with analysis paralysis here. And I think that everybody might benefit from reframing this discussion, in that we have to start like narrowing our options, getting into more of the details. I think that's cumbersome if we move forward with all 7 alternatives. If there are preferences, I think we need to start looking at those details. And then if we see something we're concerned with, there's nothing that stops us from taking a step back. But I think if we try to complete the same level of analysis on all 7 alternatives, we're going to be stuck in this like unending cycle of review and consideration. And so I think we do need to start recognizing that if there are things that are a higher priority to us, then maybe that brings some of these alternatives to the forefront. I also think that as it relates to the FAA and the airlines, they're really important stakeholders, but I think we will also benefit from sharing our recommendations as opposed to asking permission and direction from them. I think that we need to ask them to react and share concerns, significant concerns that they have with what ends up being our preferred alternative, so that we're driving this process and not sitting back and waiting for the FAA to complete an analysis that they've shared with us that they don't frankly have the time or staff available to do so. And so I think it's important that we're driving this process and we're engaging them and asking for their feedback, but that we're letting them know what our preferences are and then asking them to shed light on anything we might have missed or not considered fully. So I'd like us to keep kind of moving forward with that.
Chairman, may I respond?
Aaron, did you want to respond?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Karen, I think that's well said. I will tell you that I think in real time, I think we can get airline feedback. I think the FAA has been a good partner and they generally help us proceed in the right direction. I don't know that the FAA would give us definitive answers because that would be considered pre-decisional, right? The blue box on the right is the FAA's official opportunity to review and comment in accordance with their agency procedures and those promulgated under NEPA. But I do like the idea of continuing to check in with the FAA, make sure we're on the right track, make sure we have no fatal flaws, such that when this submittal is made, we should be in for a fairly smooth review process, right? So I think the airline's ability to respond is perhaps more what you're looking for. I think the FAA will be a little bit higher level. So I just wanted to share that so as to manage all of the committee members' expectations.
Okay, Aaron. Also, Karen, I'd like to say that your first part of your comment is something that we all got to remember. If we begin to get interested in a particular alternative, and we begin to tweak it, and we begin to realize that maybe this alternative isn't what we were looking for, we can back up again. Once we start narrowing alternatives, we are not set in stone, but at least we're going in a direction in which we can continue. That's the way I see it. And with that, Ernie.
Thank you, Joe. Good morning again, everyone. I think based on the IFQ reports that we just reviewed and the IFQ 1.0, which was the earlier in the year before we got back into construction season, I wonder if the committee would want to take consideration to modifying criteria 2 that says we have to use all the runways. It seems to me, statistically, every time we put the crosswinds in play, even with the reduced operations because of COVID, we just don't get compliance. And I don't think we're ever going to get compliance with a set of 7,500-foot runways when there's 13,000 feet available. And now that we know that the FAA has given its tacit approval that once we build the western end of 9 right, 27 left, that it could be considered as a long runway alternate as well. And I think it's something we have to consider.
Okay, thank you. Cynthia?
Hi, this kind of speaks a little bit to the analysis paralysis, but it also speaks to refocusing the group. I think there's some concepts out there that are maybe lending credibility to alternatives that don't uphold the mission of the Fly Quiet Committee, which is the goal is to minimize and equally distribute aircraft noise at night. We forget about the minimize. This is important to the heading discussion if we get into that today, even though it's not on the agenda, because severe headings increase noise to those that are most impacted, and that's those people who live within the flight path under 3,000 feet. So that, alone is counterproductive to minimizing noise. The dispersion of noise is the goal also. The Fly Quiet runway rotation program does that. But the appropriate way to disperse the noise is to equally distribute runway use among the runways available to us at night. So I think in evaluating the various alternatives, I know our group, we've really strived for fairness in use of all runways available to us at night. We have 9 communities that are distributed around all of the long runways. And we've spent a lot of time, working through issues to be sure that we can, as a group of 9, represent what's fair to all 9. So we just ask that when you evaluate the alternatives, you consider those issues, that every community benefits from the airport and every community needs to share in the burden of the airport. We've also come up with a silent quadrant week concept. We originally entered this endeavor to give communities periods of relief. With the need of alternate long runways, that's a very difficult thing to do for any community living at either end of a north or south parallel set of runways. But some of these alternatives far outperform the other in providing complete silent quadrant weeks. And, keep in mind, in a 12-week schedule, there are 4 quadrants. So the maximum silent quadrant weeks you could have in that period is 48 because there's 4 quadrants. So if you start to look at the alternatives that way, you can really, really differentiate them on which alternatives are really going to be fair in giving as many communities silent quadrant weeks as possible.
Hey, thank you. Ron?
Yeah, I just wanted to bring something up for the committee to keep in mind that not only are you going to be looking at a new program for nighttime, but that program will also include implementation and how it's going to be monitored. The IFQ that's going on now really doesn't have a monitoring component to it where you question why certain things happen the way they do. So yes, there may be a lower percentage use of runways in certain configurations, but without a monitoring program in place, it's not going to improve. So this program that you guys are coming up with now will include a way to monitor that, to question why things happen. And there is a lot that can be done to try to increase the use of certain runway configurations as long as someone's on top of it and watching over it and questioning things as they happen.
Well, I do know that a Flight Quiet Committee is not going to be dissolved after we're done with this. I suspect that the Flight Quiet Committee is going to be watching every month as to what's going on. Even if, when
Well, that and you also have your tech committee, which I think is probably the best place for it to be happening on a monthly basis, almost to monitor the programs and work with the airlines and the FAA to make sure the implementation is done the way it's supposed to be.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, why don't we,
Evan has a question. Sure.
Evan, and then let's move on. Evan?
Yeah, Joe, I know that SOC submitted a letter to you regarding four of the approved alternatives. I think it's a really good read. I think the committee would benefit from reading through. It only analyzed the four that survived at the last meeting, so it didn't analyze the ones that we brought back. But if you could circulate that to the committee, I think it's a good read and brings up some solid points about a few of the configurations and highlights some of the negative externalities of a few of the other ones. So if you could circulate that, I would appreciate it.
And in fact, I will, Evan. I was going to make a comment at the end of the meeting about the letter, but you've done it for me, so thank you. Everybody will have an opportunity to see the letter. If we can move on now to 7. Is it possible that we take a quick look at D and G before we get into B, C, and H? Am I asking too much, Ryan?
Well, I guess what are you asking? So there's been no changes to D, E, F, and G or B, C, and H at this time. So everyone has the same material from the last meeting. Is this something you want to?
I think what I'm concerned with is that somebody may have a question out there and is not coming forward with it because in fact, one of the concerns I have at a committee, it seems like only certain people talk and everybody else doesn't talk, and they may have or may not have questions.
Sure.
And I'm bringing these two up because two of them were thought to be should have been eliminated last time.
Which
alternatives? What's that?
Which alternatives would you like me to review?
D and G real quickly, and please, if you have a question about these things, ask.
Okay.
Chairman, point of clarification, did you say B and G, like
D,
Bravo and Golf?
No, D and G.
Dog and golf?
Yeah.
So Chairman, those are not on the agenda for today. Did you want to add these? G is on the.
Yeah, I want to add them quickly because there may be questions about them. And I just want to get them out of the way as long as we're together, because we're not going to get together again until the 27th of January. Unless I call a special meeting. And I just want to make sure everybody is on board as to what these alternatives really are.
Okay.
Because frankly, one of the things I noticed about getting rid of the 4 last week, there's hardly any discussion. It was just done. And it's either because everybody was on top of everything or they didn't know what questions to ask. And I'm really concerned about that.
Understood, Chairman. Thank you.
Okay, so alternative D, the major characteristics of alternative D is it is a 12-week rotation schedule that consists of 10 configurations, both east-west and crosswind. The one major characteristic that makes it different from alternatives B, C, and H is that it incorporates the full airfield concept, meaning that, and if I advance to the next slide, you'll see this better. Each week we are using one runway on the north airfield and one runway on the south airfield. And this is different than alternatives B, C, and H, where we segregate the operations to either the north airfield or the south airfield week to week. This alternative also incorporates vector headings only. We have one vector heading per week for the east-west configurations. And then when the crosswind configurations come up in the schedule, there are two headings. So for 1 week, it'll use one heading, and then the next iteration in the schedule, it will use a second vector heading for departures. There are a total of 8 east-west weeks and 4 crosswind weeks in the schedule. And this is the 12-week schedule with all of the configurations being used. Again, the major characteristic that differentiates this alternative from B, C, and H is the full airfield concept versus the north and south split airfield concept.
Okay, thank you. Evan, you have a question?
No, that was in regards to the SOC letter. That was addressed. I'm good for now.
Oh, I'm sorry. Ernie, do you have a question?
I do, Joe. Thank you. Ryan, put up the arrow map again, the one that has all the weeks. Will you please? I thought one of the criteria, and somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought one of the criteria was not to have repetitive weeks. Since we know that this airport operates the majority of time in west flow, especially during the winter, it looks like week 1 and week 2 would be exactly the same because we're going to have to turn the airport around. I'm not going to be able to work at an east flow. And the same thing with weeks 4 or 5. So if one of the criteria was to avoid repetitive weeks.
Ernie, I actually agree with you on this one. I think we need clarification of what that criteria means, the consecutive impact criteria. Is it?
Ryan, do you have that slide with the criteria that you can bring up? For all the committee members, I would say there is some confusion, so we're happy to review that. It's my understanding that the criterion as written is not an absolute, and so it's appropriate to bring this back to you to see if that's the committee's intent. Is it an absolute, or is it to the extent practical?
Aaron, if I may, Joe, if I may comment, Aaron, if that's the case, then I'm gonna come back on point 2, which said we have to use all the available runways, which rejected my proposal of splitting the airfield and using just the parallels. Because as long as we use the 422s, I don't know why we don't understand this. As long as the 422s are being used, the parallels are still going to be used. And especially a majority of the time, as we've seen in the statistics. I'm not making up the rules here. We've seen it in all the IFQ reports. So if that's the case, and if that's the case, and we don't, if these aren't hard and fast rules, then I'm going to ask that my rejected proposal get put back in the mix.
Understand. Chairman, may I respond?
Aaron, to answer your question, I've always thought these as to be looked at as technically feasible. I mean,
understood,
not
Chairman.
absolute.
Chairman, may I respond?
Yeah.
Ernie, so criterion 2 is very clear. It says the following runways at a minimum should be in the schedule, and it lists all 6 specifically. I think criterion 5, there's a little bit of wiggle room in that it says minimize, 2 periods in a row. So is minimize like the absolute, like minimize and nothing else, or minimize to the extent? And so I think this criterion 5 with the phrase the word minimize is really what you and Evan are talking about with respect to that option you were just looking at.
So let me ask you, Aaron, let me ask you, Joe, if I could respond, please.
Yeah.
Aaron, let me ask you, if that's the case and that's a hard and fast rule for criteria 2, do we need to, by vote, modify that rule so that the committee is not hamstrung by saying, I gotta use every available runway. I mean, what happens if someday the FAA decides to, which I think we all know won't happen, but what if they decide to put the north and south towers in play? Does that mean the very north and south runways got to get put in the mix as well? Not the way it's written here, but I'd like your opinion as to do I need to modify that criteria in order to in order to allow us? I'm sorry for rambling on. In order to allow the committee to consider other proposals that doesn't have to put 2 runways in play that not everybody's going to want to use.
Ernie, I think you need to look at the words themselves. Number 2 is written as an absolute. Okay, that's written as an absolute. You shall use 9C20, blah, blah, blah. You shall use all those runways. Number 4 is not an absolute. It's more like a may, because to minimize means you got to look at other criteria. You got to look at whether it's technically feasible or not, for instance. You got to look at that, because if it's not technically feasible to do, for instance, it can't be done. So you've done everything to minimize it, given the fact that physics doesn't allow certain things.
Chairman, I would add that the question that Ernie and Evan have raised with regard to consecutive weeks is valid. In criterion 4, we use the phrase, Ryan's got his mouse on it. In criterion 4, we say to the extent possible. We do not have that language in criterion 5. So it would be helpful to get direction from the committee. You know, does criterion 5 mean to the extent possible, even though it doesn't say that? Or is criterion 5 an absolute?
Well, again, if you use the term minimize to mean something more than something slightly less than absolute, because minimize is not an absolute term. Minimize is to a certain extent. So I'd have to say that avoid executive impacts also must be looked at and not as an absolute, the way it's written.
Hey, Joe, can I respond to Ernie?
Sure.
So,
and then
Ernie,
Dan and Cynthia are also going to get a chance to talk.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Ernie, I don't know. This has gone on for so long, and 2020 has been such a weird year. I don't know. I can't remember at what point you came onto the committee, but criteria number 2 was a significant conversation where we did discuss the fact that the crosswind runways have a significantly lower utilization rate. But I think the point you're missing is that we never achieve 100% on any of the runways. We saw that in Ryan's report today, that the FAA flight checks always mean, or runway safety checks always mean that we're never going to achieve 100%. And also that the committee felt at the time when we took our vote, and I still feel this way today, that even 13% utilization of the crosswinds is 13% fewer flights on the parallel runways. And so, like, it's not perfect. It's not as high as we would like it to be, but I think the committee felt that it was better than nothing, because if you take the crosswinds out, you are forcing 100% of those flights on the parallel runways. Or I'm sorry, Aaron, I'm screwing up your terminology, the east-west runways. And so if you want to bring it to a vote, like, let's vote, but it's not absent that conversation. We've had this conversation. We intentionally made the decision to include those crosswinds because they did provide, even if minimal, some level of relief for the east-west runways and the communities that surround those.
Well, if I could respond, Joe, Karen, I appreciate your comments. They're valid. I wasn't on the committee at that time. Kathy Dunlap was the Northeast representative from the 41st Ward. She and Alderman Chester, if I recall correctly, voted to dissent to not include that language that was, I think, if I remember correctly, was proposed by Alderman Dunn. And I understand your comment, but the problem I have with using the crosswinds is that no matter how you use them, what ends up happening is you're still using the parallels. And if you get 13 or 20% participation, you're talking about, 12 or 15 flights a night when we go back to full operation. That doesn't seem to be an efficient way to run the airport, and I'm not sure it saves anybody any noise.
Okay, Ernie?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, because we got other people with questions. All right.
Thank you.
All right. Dan?
Yes, I think Evan and Ernie make good points about clarifying consecutive impacts. And we think now that we've learned more about what's feasible and what's not, that in particular is an opportunity for the committee as a group to establish some benchmarks of what expectations are for consecutive impacts and apply those to some of these alternatives. What we feel is all these alternatives have issues once you apply that it's actually a wind-driven rotation. And so you really do need some further criteria for consecutive impacts to really analyze what the most balanced plan would end up being.
Chairman, may
All
I
right.
jump in just with something
Sure.
quick?
Yeah.
One point of clarification for the committee. You know, criterion 5 says the same type of arrivals or departures 2 periods in a row. It does not say east-west 2 periods in a row. So there may be some confusion with if the rotation shows impacts to a community 1 week because of arrivals and then impacts the next week due to departures, that is still consistent with the wording of this criterion, because it says arrivals or departures 2 periods in a row, not and. So there may be some confusion with the wording of the criterion and the common understanding of the criterion. And I just raised that in case the committee wants to talk about that further.
And can I add on also that when we look at these criterion, we're applying them to the primary plan configurations. You know, we're not at this point looking at the secondary configurations. We haven't even talked about secondary configurations yet. And, you know, these specifically 4 and 5 were used in tests 1, 2, and 3 and IFQ. And, you know, we didn't always have, once we got to the secondary configurations, it wasn't always the exact reciprocal configuration where we had, where we just flipped the arrivals or departures. So when it comes to these 7 alternatives, we're just looking at the primary scheduled configurations and how they apply to these criterion.
If I could comment, some concern with that, because particularly when we see an airfield that may be 80% driven west flow, that we really need to factor in those secondary in some of these decisions, because ultimately that's the lived experience is the wind. And to the extent possible, make sure that those secondaries minimize consecutive impacts.
All right. Cynthia, Alderman Dunn, and Ron. Cynthia, you're first.
Okay, so there's a lot to address here. First of all, the fly quiet criteria, this is the second iteration of this criteria, and you know, it has withstood the test of time throughout several rotation programs, and I think served the committee very well. In regards to the crosswind runway performances, I think people are misunderstanding the measure of their ability to provide relief due to the fact that every time we utilize a 10 left, 28 right long runway with the crosswinds in play, that knocks us out of being credited the performance of those crosswind configurations, which makes them appear to be performing poorly. But we can show you in runway rotation program 1 through 3, where there was very good performance, even heavy aircraft use of those runways. What's knocking us out of performance is our configurations right now in this latest program, and none of these to date have acknowledged the need for that alternate long runway. Adding to that, we are using 10 left, 28 right as the alternate long runway right now for both the northeast crosswind flow and the southwest crosswind flow. The FAA has instructed us that 9 right is the preferred long runway in a northeast flow. So when we force them to use 10 left, 28 right, that puts some safety criteria on the tower, which if the tower is at all short on resources, we have seen over and over throughout all rotation programs that they default out of the rotation program into a 10 left, 28 right configuration. And that, you know, we've struggled with that from day one because we really need that alternative long runway in that north airfield. As far as consecutive impacts, I think alternative 5 has provided the guidance. I think it is a critical criteria in being able to eliminate some of these alternatives, because some will honor that and minimize consecutive impacts to the extent possible, and some are overburdening the long runway communities with regular consecutive impacts. And when we look at that, we really need to look at the alternate long runway, because we've just somewhat ignored that. But those are the heavy aircraft who are 10 times louder than the lighter fleet. And really, to be fair and fairly distribute the impact, those consecutive impacts have to consider those alternate long runways. There are several configurations or alternatives that fairly do not have consecutive impacts, either on an alternate or a primary configuration. And I think that is a critical criteria to differentiate between which alternatives should move forward and which should not.
All right, thank you, Cynthia. Alderman Dunn.
Yes, thanks, Mr. Chair. It's our position that we are designing a rotation program with primary, a plan A each week, a primary flow. There is also a plan B, secondary flow, which really generally is driven by the prevailing winds. And it's our belief that we're designing this rotation based on the primary configuration and not the secondary configurations, that the secondary flows that may occur on a week-to-week basis. There is scenarios where you're in west flow in the plan, and the prevailing are out of the east, and you have to flip, and vice versa. You're in the plan that week, it's an east flow, and the prevailing winds are out of the west, you have to flip. So it's our belief that we're designing a rotation program based on the plan A each week, the plan B as a fallback. And very secondarily to that is the long runway usage. All the configurations that were provided by the CDA, those long runways are shaded on departures, because that's usually almost exclusively where a pilot rests a long runway upon takeoff. They're in a heavy load situation, and information's been shared with us that it's significantly much more operations in the evening that are arrivals and landings, to the order of 2/3 landings versus departures. So the occasional request for a long runway for a departure is, in our opinion, the tail wagging the dog. So it's our position that number 5 is wrapped around the plan A each week for the arrival and departure runway. Doesn't include the plan B or secondary flow, and really doesn't include the long runway usage.
Okay, thank you. Ron?
Yeah, just to add on and build on what Cynthia said, I think the committee needs to keep in mind that you can't compare the airfield with the existing IFQ with the airfield, what it's going to be in another year. It's a totally different airfield. Right now, whenever there's a long runway needed, everything defaults to the south airfield. That's not going to be the case in the future. The case, you're going to have a north airfield as well that can handle 99.9% of the operations in and out of the airport if needed at night. So I do think as you go forward, you will see that there will be ways to design a program to where you can give communities complete relief for at least a week at a time. So basically just don't look at what's going on with the existing airfield now, because that's apples to oranges, what it's going to be like within another year. And second, on the number 5, I think the committee needs to keep in mind that looking at, you don't want multiple arrivals in consecutive weeks or multiple departures in consecutive weeks. It should just be basically operations in consecutive weeks, because whether it's an arrival or a departure, it's going to impact someone and someone's going to be upset about it. So really should be looking at, you don't want to hit a community twice over a 2-week period. You want to try to give the community a period that is predictable, that they're not going to have overflights for the majority of the time. That was one of the main things when this whole thing started 4 or 5 years ago, was predictability. It was one of the biggest things that communities wanted, so they could tell their residents, look at the schedule and you'll know next week or in 2 weeks, for that week, you likely will not have any overflights, or if you have any, it'll be very few. So predictability is the big thing. And I think trying to say just arrivals or just departures for 2 periods in a row is not the right way to look at it. It should be operations for 2 periods in a row.
Okay, thank you. Ernie?
Thank you, Joe. Just a comment. Ron, I appreciate your comments. I understand where you're coming from, but this sounds a lot like I got to pass the bill to find out what's in it. Okay. I mean, we've run an EIS, we're doing 2 rounds of IFQ, and if you're telling me that once 927 center opens and we extend 9 right, 27 left, everything's going to be different, then all this modeling we've done has been a waste of time. Am I wrong in that?
Yeah, it's not a waste of time, but the purpose of the IFQ to start, and Aaron and Ryan, correct me if I'm wrong, but basically was, can a rotation work, period. So we did some tests and said, yes, it can work. And can we give some relief to communities in the interim so that while we're waiting on the full airfield to take place and this new program to come in, can we give the community some interim relief? And that's what the IFQ has been all along, was 1, can a rotation take place? And 2, can we give them some interim relief until we have a full airfield and we design a brand new program to take into effect what that full airfield provides? So it hasn't been done in vain, but I think if you're looking at it, what's happened in the past negates things that can happen in the future. You can't do that. That wasn't the purpose of the IFQ.
Well, let me just throw out for those of us in the Northeast quadrant. If you designate 9 right as the long alternate runway on East flow nights and you're running the diagonals, what part of the Northeast quadrant doesn't get noise? Everybody's going to get it then. You're going to get it. You're going to get it over D Road. You're going to get it down the Higgins-Peterson corridor. I mean, how is that fair?
Well, that's the purpose is that's going to happen for a period of time, like a week. But the following week, it could switch to the south airfield, and then that north airfield, the north quadrant that you're talking about, is not going to get any overflights. So yeah, there's going to be 1 week where you're going to get overflights, but there may be another week or another 2 or 3 weeks where that quadrant doesn't get any overflights. That was the goal, I think, of developing this whole new program. I mean, Ryan, other people, Aaron, correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, that to me was what the goal was.
Ernie, are you trying to avoid all noise in your quadrant? Hard stop?
No, not at all.
No.
No.
Ernie, if you're going to have that discussion, have it outside of the meeting. All right? Because we're already running past an hour with this meeting. And although I asked everybody to have an honest, frank discussion, let's not go there with that one. Please? Thanks.
Evan, I'll call you after the meeting, bud.
Cynthia, you're next.
Yeah, I was just going to speak to the same issue. What Ernie is describing in the Northeast quadrant is also true for the Southwest quadrant. And if you want to pull that and apply it to the communities that end at the North,
Kevin, how are you?
live at the end of the north and south parallels. That's the impact those communities get. You know, from a fairness standpoint, the diagonals stayed in the configuration for.
All right.
Sorry, there's a lot. Somebody needs to mute.
Wait a minute. It's one person at a time.
Someone needs to mute their computer.
The whole concept of the diagonals not being used is flawed. OMP left these diagonals in because they are critical runways. They provide a critical service. If they could have gotten rid of them, they would have, because they complicate the airfield. But they stayed in for a very valid reason. They are very valid runways. They have been fly quiet departure runways forever. So they do have a role. Even if they are put into the schedule at the same level of the longer runways, they're still only going to be 60% of the departures, which is a reasonable load for those communities to carry.
Somebody needs to mute if they're not talking.
I'm not overly concerned.
Do you have the authority to mute that person?
I'm trying to figure out who that person is.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm not particularly concerned, frankly. I mean, if
It's JF, whoever that is.
Okay.
Two organizations.
Get him?
Other organizations.
He's right below Ryan Anderson in the queue.
Helpful.
Got it.
We definitely did want to make sure that we.
Thank you.
Man, come on, everybody. This is tough as it is. Think about what you're doing when you're using this machine. All right. There doesn't seem to be any more questions. I'm afraid I opened up a can of worms today, but I think these are cans of worms we're going to have to open up. And it may be a discussion that will take hours, but we're going to have to start thinking about going in this direction if we're going to come to a conclusion here. Ryan, I asked you to talk about G also. Just to shorten this a bit, is there something that D and G have in common that's important to us?
So G again, and can everybody switch screens here? I just want to make sure everyone can see. G, similar to D, the major characteristic is again that full airfield concept.
And that's important. Yes.
So once again, this alternative incorporates the full airfield concept, where we have a primary and arrival and departure runways operating on the north and south airfield versus isolating those to either the north or south airfield. This alternative also incorporates some of what we refer to as the hybrid configuration. So you'll see here GG, where we have arrivals on 22 right and departures on 28 center. So they incorporate a crosswind runway paired with a east-west runway. None of our other alternatives utilize those configurations. Some of those configurations, as we've discussed before, have some restrictions to them because they have converging runway issues. It doesn't mean that they can't be used, but there are restrictions to them. But those are the kind of two major characteristics that differentiate G from the other alternatives, a full airfield and also incorporating hybrid configurations.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. I wanted those two discussed because over the Christmas holiday break, keep that in mind when you're looking at D and G. That's all. And I'm sorry that took so long, but I think it needed to be done. If we can move on to review.
Joe, are there any advocates for a full airfield approach? I just don't know.
I don't know either. I think what I'm going to do is find out over the break.
Well,
And so
can we ask that question right now? And if you are in favor of full airfield, you want to speak up, and just so we know. not taking a vote. I just don't know if anybody even wants this. This may be low hanging fruit that we can start making progress and move forward on.
That's what I'm hoping for.
I'll speak up if no one else will.
I'll
Somebody-
speak up.
Who's
You
speaking?
want full airfield? Okay, that's good to know.
I think it's the way you determine full airfield versus north-south airfield is you look at those headings and community overlap for intersection versus full-length departures. That's sort of the key determination. The other one is that assurance from the FAA on runway closures. I think the full airfield is a little better equipped if in the end we're not able to close runways. So I think those are the two key points. And if you can, come to a conclusion that there is no distinction, then at least we've discussed it.
Okay, now having had that small conversation right now, if somebody makes a motion to eliminate D or G at the next meeting, there'll be a full discussion on what using the full airport really means, so that a determination could be made as to whether we do actually eliminate D and G, because it's not what the group is interested in. Okay, having said that, we got two more questions. Ernie and then Dennis.
My question was answered, Chair. Thank you.
Dennis.
I've got just a quick summary here. We recently have had two, I think, very successful trials. And I'd like to maybe, before we completely go back into what our final decision's going to be, to look at our successes and our failures during those two things. So it'll give us a better idea going forward, what to plan for. I can see where, if we've had a lot of failure on a certain part of our trial, let's make it, get that out of there right away, to plan for a more successful finish on this. That's all I have to say.
Okay, Cynthia, and then we're going to turn it back to Ryan. And if there's questions after that, then we'll take questions after what Ryan has to say. Cynthia?
Just one comment on the full airfield. The majority of the configurations put noise in 3 quadrants of the airfield. So the most silence you can get in a full airfield alternative is 12 quadrants out of a 12-week schedule. So you've got 25% performance rate on giving people true relief, which is silence in their quadrant of the airfield. The other important issue with the split airfield configurations is the FAA flagged 2 of those for further study. I think assigning an alternative going forward and submitting it in an EIS to the FAA when they have already told us that those configurations have issues is a lesser quality product to move forward than alternatives that don't include those configurations. And that's where we're not in support of the full airfield concept because of the unequal impacts it gives to both the north and south parallel communities.
Joe, just to follow up, and I appreciate that we'll have a discussion on the next meeting. Full airfield does not impact 3 quadrants. It has the same quadrant predictability. The difference is that what's happening on the north airfield, or east versus west, is split between the north and south as opposed to just in the north or south. That's the distinction. It's not quadrant predictability, but we look forward to the discussion at the next meeting.
Okay, Suzanne, I know you have a comment to make, but let's finish up the agenda and as soon as we can, so we can hear what you'd like to say too, okay? With that, Ryan?
Yeah, 2 things. One, before I move on, from these alternatives. I just want to make sure everyone understands alternatives D, E, F, and G all incorporate that full airfield characteristic. So all 4 of those alternatives that were removed from consideration last meeting and that were brought back today for further consideration incorporate the full airfield characteristic.
Are you on mute?
Some of the, in our discussions that we've had when Chairman Annunzio asked committee members to submit any alternatives that they want to have considered, we received alternatives as well as modifications to existing alternatives. And so what I want to talk about now is some of those suggested modifications that we received. And these can be incorporated into the alternatives moving forward as we review and refine them. The first alternative B, we had several suggestions to modify them. The first one being limit the vector headings to no more than 20 degrees from the runway center line. Currently, that alternative has 2 vector headings per departure runway, one at 10 degrees and one at 25 degrees off runway center line. The second suggested modification was to swap weeks 4 with 5 and weeks 10 and 11 to, this goes back to the discussion on consecutive impacts and how that is interpreted. The third item was to include more than 2 departure headings per configuration. So right now, alternative B only has 2 vector departure headings per departure runway. However, there was a request to add more than 2. And then also to, and I think this is something that we're going to do with all of the alternatives, is to examine further refinements to the actual headings themselves, whether or not there needs to be some slight modifications to the actual headings to make them more refined. Suggested modifications to alternative C, again, limit the vector headings to no more than 20 degrees versus 25 degrees. Again, alternative C is very similar to alternative B. It's the same schedule. It just incorporates RNAV on the crosswind runways versus vector headings. And so the same comment to swaps weeks 4 and 5 and 10 and 11 to avoid consecutive impacts, and examine further refinements to specific vector headings. Alternative E, limit to only 1 departure vector heading per runway. So we received a request that for alternative E, which has currently 2 departure headings per runway, departure vector headings per runway, to limit those to just 1 vector heading. And when we limit that to 1, the request was to keep the 295 degree vector heading for runway 27 left and the 245 degree vector heading for runway 28 right. And again, and then to further review and refine the departure vector headings for the remaining runways. And so those were the additional modifications that we received from committee members that can be incorporated into the alternatives as we move forward with them.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. Cynthia, you have a question?
Yeah, I just have one request to let Craig Burzich speak regarding the full airfield concept. We really need to consider air traffic's perspective on this, and Craig is the one person on the call that has that direct experience of living in that tower and operating air traffic at night. Craig, are you able to visit that issue?
Yes, and all I want to say is that the split airfield concept is not controller friendly. It's not. I'm not saying the tower will refuse to do it, but you may get flagged back because it's not user friendly. So it's the equivalent of going to a sports bar to watch the Bears game. Why you'd want to do that, I don't know. But if they had the Bears game on one wall and then you wanted to watch another football game and they had it 180 degrees behind you, you could do it, but you're going to be constantly looking back and forth. And more often than not, you're going to turn around and say, wow, I missed a touchdown, or I missed a field goal. In air traffic, that's not supposed to happen. You're supposed to watch everything. So you're splitting the airfield up. You may get flagged. If you do north, south separate, everything's in front of the controller. They can see everything. And you got to remember, during the day, or at a busy 16, there's 2 different people working runways, or 3 different people. 3 in the morning, it's the same person. And they're also answering phone calls and, you know, cutting the ATIS every hour and doing all the other coordination and everything else. So that split concept is not controller friendly.
Okay, thank you. If we can move on now.
Chair, if I might, Craig, I just want to make sure we have our terms right on clarification. I thought we've been using a split airfield concept, meaning we use the north airfield one week, the south airfield another week. I just want to make sure I'm catching the gravity of this.
Right. Well, what I'm talking about is when if you're going to land on 22 right and then and depart 22 left, let's say on one of those configurations, so you got one runway on the north airfield and a second runway in use on the south airfield. Those runways are on different sides of the airfield, where the other concepts are everything's on the north side.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, so Craig's concern was with the full airfield concepts. I think maybe I messed up the terminology there. It is when you're splitting the attention, we think of it as splitting the attention of the air traffic controllers north and south, which is really a full airfield utilization concept.
Yeah, I think I messed that up, Cynthia. And what I was referring to is the full airfield concept is not friendly to the tower.
Thank you.
Could I ask a question to Brian and Aaron, just in the conversations with the FAA, what their view is on this? They approved 28
Just ask if you could do it, or did you just do it?
Well, what I can say is, you know, there is some merit to efficiency and attention being, you know, isolated into a north airfield versus south airfield. We haven't sat down and really discussed this with the tower, but that's there is merit to that. However, the airport operates today as a full airfield, meaning their attention is split every night. You know, we have operations that arrive 27 left and depart 28 right every night, or 28 center. So that full airfield concept is not something that air traffic control doesn't do on an everyday basis. That's what they do today. But okay, there is merit to isolating their attention, especially during the overnight hours.
I just think it's important to note, until we hear different, the FAA has approved all 28 of those configurations for air traffic feasibility. Is that correct?
With the caveats that they've included in those approvals.
All right, thank you.
All right. I'd just like to remind everybody, and you've been really good about this, but if you have something you want to add, tell Jeanette through the chat box, and then she'll inform me, and then you'll get a chance. Okay, just don't start shouting at each other, because it's not going to work. Having said that, the next ONCC Fly Quiet meeting is scheduled for January 28, 2021. It will be a Zoom teleconference meeting at 9:30. I think I'm going to move, since we've had plenty of comments from the members, let's go to the comment from the audience. Suzanne, you got something to say?
I think I'm the only audience comment. Yes, I do. I would have loved to have been part of the active conversation, but hopefully my comments have not aged like milk. What I'd like to say is, as we look at, and thank you, by the way, Aaron, for allowing these other options to be brought back in. I'm aware as
that wasn't Aaron, that was the committee, by the way, Suzanne.
Oh, well, but he introduced it again.
No. Evan introduced it.
Evan, okay.
Let's give credit where credit's due.
Evan, I meant Evan on it. So what I'd like to say is, as we look at all of these, something that we have proposed and wanted to do, and I agree with Karen, there's a lot of paralysis analysis. I think what happens, the community gets lost in the weeds sometimes. What we'd like to propose, and is for all these configurations, let's come up with some basic bucket benchmarks, things like predictability, equity, sustainability, and then rate these items like, how do these of these 6 configurations, what are our priorities? Have the committee rate them on a scale of 1 to 5, and because I think, for example, predictability is a huge everybody wants predictability. Residents, myself, we expect that independent of the wind and maintenance schedule. So we would rate these configurations based on these benchmarks. And then the ones that don't meet these benchmarks are like something that's a 4 we keep, something that's a 1 we get away with. But that way, first, the group is on a level playing field as to how we define these items. And then you can dig down, okay, for predictability, let's say 1 runway, then you can start looking at it. How often is wind driving it down? How often is maintenance affecting it? What's secondary? But I think we need to be on an even basis, because we go into details and I see people's eyes and attention glaze over. And I think if we broke it down simpler, because we have a lot of details to go into. Once we are in agreement as to once we're in agreement about these items, then we can drill down and go deep on very specific, like heading, configurations, and wind and schedule on each particular configuration. So I think we have more. There's more buy-in, for noise and things. I see we go into all these details, and then we kind of get lost in the weeds instead of looking at the big picture. And I know my timing is short, so I'll cut it down. Secondly, 13% utilization to me is not good. I think we should and can do better and expect more. And last, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the ONCC actually has the power and the authority to set the standards of what they expect, rather than, hey, let's hope airlines and everybody self-regulates. I understand we want to work together, but at the end, this committee has the power to say, this is what we want. And I would urge you to be able to do that. So thank you.
All right, thank you, Cynthia. And with that, do I hear a motion to adjourn the meeting?
I'll move so.
Second.
All right. Jeanette, you want to do a roll call?
I'm sorry, Chairman. Evan has his hand raised, and so does Frank Ikas.
Oh, okay. Evan, you're first.
I just can you state what you just sent me privately, publicly? What are we doing at the next meeting?
Well, tell you the truth, what we're going to have to do is the executive committee gets together to make the final decision. But it seems to me what we can do is start putting things on the agenda to have a discussion as to whether alternatives, I should say, so to have a discussion to determine whether or not they can be considered to be eliminated. We got to start doing that. Okay.
So, I agree. So we're going to start voting on things next meeting?
Yes.
Great, thank you.
Yes.
And with that, please, everybody, be prepared to have a serious discussion on all these alternatives, with the idea that at the same time, we're going to have to start thinking about compromise at the same time too, if we're going to get anything done. Okay. Let's see, Evan, and who was the other person?
Frank.
Frank, I'm sorry, Frank.
Thank you, Chair. I'm speaking, I guess, as a member of the ONCC, but in the public forum here. A mention was made of true relief. It's a nice word. True relief from noise. I don't believe that's going to ever be possible for anyone living around any airport. So that's not an expectation to get true relief. Now, another phrase, minimum disturbance. That is something that's possible. That is something that this group should be trying to provide. Every iteration of a plan that you've given impacts someone at some time. Some of the people are impacted more than others. Discussion here is devolving into a sort of NIMBY, not in my backyard.
That's exactly why I said compromise.
What's that, Joe?
That's exactly why I said compromise when we come back.
I know, and I'm on your side on this. I think, and I'm going to go back and beat this dead horse again, Joe. We need to find a way to minimize the operations at the airfield at night. If we can get the CDA to take an active role in trying to minimize, not eliminate, but minimize some of these flights. We can all see that right now, with the current number of operations, everyone is getting some relief. I mean, it can't be stated enough with enough force. Right now, I think if you took a poll of everyone that's on this call, the members and non-members, is it quieter now than it has been? Everyone would say yes. Is it tolerable? Yes. Let's try to find a way that we could keep the operations at about what they are now, and I think everyone would be happy. Now, the other thing, I understand how committees work. Committees do all the hard work, and then the commission on a whole is going to vote on what this committee recommends at some point in time. I think the other members of the commission who, unlike myself, don't show up here at these monthly meetings are going to be voting blind. They have no idea what's going on here. You mentioned crosswinds to them or vectors or RNAV, and their eyes are going to gloss over and spin in their head. Personally, I don't think other people in a commission are going to be qualified to make an educated vote on this. And if given the opportunity with the general meeting, when it comes up, I will mention that the people are not educated enough on the process, on the terms, on anything. So if we can just try to minimize the flights, I think this is going to go a long way. It'll help us more than anything that this committee's done in the past. Thank you.
Okay, look, when we do a motion to adjourn the meeting, guys, stop me before the motion is made, because a motion to adjourn is something you have a discussion on. It's either a yes or a no. Okay, just to keep the thing straight. If there isn't any other comments, we have a second on the adjournment. Do we have a roll call, Jeanette?
Bentonville,
Yes.
City of Chicago 39th Ward,
Yes.
Des Plaines,
Yes.
Elmhurst,
Aye.
Harwood Heights,
Aye.
Niles,
Yes.
Park Ridge,
Yes and yes.
River Grove,
Yes and yes, and Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to all.
Schaumburg,
Yes.
Schiller Park,
Yes and yes.
and Wooddale.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. I just got one comment to make. Frank, you need to measure your words. To suggest that this committee is unqualified to make a decision.
No.
Joe,
I didn't say the committee was unqualified to make a decision. I said the commission members.
And with that, I'm leaving. See you later, guys.
You ended the meeting, Joe.
I ended it.
You did.
Merry Christmas, everyone.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas and a healthy New Year. Jeanette, this is Russ from Schiller Park. Are you still there?
Yes, I am.
Are you in your office? May I call you in about 10 minutes for a couple quick questions?
Sure, of course.
Very good. Thank you.
Frank,
Yes,
are you still there?
I'm still here. I'm just waiting to check out. That's all.
Oh, okay. All right.
Why, do you want to talk?
I will call you after the meeting.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.